So let's do a couple of pieces of sound, a couple of segments about what's happening in the Caribbean, and then we have another Pepe Mojica we'll do before we go. But uh, it's really, really obviously a part of this show is talking about is being globally oriented, and I do think it's also in the coming weeks we're going to talk about what's happening in Haiti, and really anchoring in the Caribbean and Latin America, both because of the colossal and damaging role that the United States plays there, also because of the dynamism and the relationships across all of the Americas and the Caribbean, and because this is a hot spot right now, even more so than usual, between the Trump administration still trying to wage a coup, potentially even a invasion of Venezuela. Uh, Putting warships in the Caribbean is, there's a threat that's very overt towards Venezuela. There's also a, maybe a subtextual indication to an oil producer like Trinidad and Tobago to not mess around with their production. Especially, this is another big thing that's happening right now that we have to get to at another show. This dispute between Russia and Saudi Arabia and how it's affected world oil markets, including Donald Trump actually talking about a bailout for the fossil fuel industry. And so let's just start with Trinidad and Tobago. This is a really significant piece of sound we're going to get to from Trinidad's Prime Minister Keith Rowley in a second. But just to be clear, the United States in the last couple of weeks has really amped up this notion of the taking the war on cocaine, the war on drugs, the cartel war to Venezuela. Now, this is bizarre on a number of levels. The prime producer of cocaine in Latin America remains Colombia, which is the U.S.'s core strategic partner, and of course, partner in many military initiatives and all sorts of other questions we could tease out, and of stories of abuse of labor union organizers, environmentalists, and indigenous communities as an example. But there is no, there's some reporting on the Venezuelan government and relationships between the military and certain aspects of the drug trade. But in the aggregate sense, the idea of focusing on Venezuela is obviously purely a political and coup-based decision. This is also in conjunction with what we talked about last week, the $15 million bounty put on the head of Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, and now an actual military presence being stationed there. This is incredibly dangerous, something we need to speak out on and fight against, even as so much is happening right now. The Trump administration has been fixated on day one on an attempt at regime change in Venezuela. And of course, we always say in 2002, there was a temporary coup backed by the Bush administration that Chavez actually overcame. It was an incredible act of heroism. And Venezuela's resistance in general is an act of heroism, as well as all Caribbean leaders, of which there are several who at enormous risk to themselves are trying to keep some sense of stability in their region and very courageously speak out against U.S. foreign policy. This is a clip from Tell Us We're English with Dr. Keith Rowley, who is the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, talking about U.S. intervention in Venezuela. And we will get to all of your thoughts after we play this clip.
Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley has once again cautioned the United States to abide by international law as the country has deployed warships and troops near Venezuela amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Rowley was speaking in a one-on-one interview with CCN TV6.
I'm sure that at the end of the day, common sense and good sense would prevail in Washington. Unfortunately, the maneuvers are taking place in our neighborhood. And we in Trinidad and Tobago, our position has been made very clear at the United Nations last September. And it may have been missed by many persons because you might ask, what do we want? What do we expect? What we want is international business being conducted and a rules-based formula. that there are rules that all the countries of the world in the United Nations, we have agreed to abide by those rules. And once we respect the rules-based formulae, everything's going to be all right.
Thoughts, guys?
Empires are good at weaponizing viruses.
Right. And I really want to emphasize, though, that this is, Mia Mottley spoke, the Prime Minister of Barbados. She did an incredibly courageous address at the UN. Look it up. We played this, speech of hers from several months ago. Comrade Ralph, the Prime Minister of the Grenadines. I'm forgetting the first part of the name. Apologies. But there is a huge amount of courage in the Caribbean community right now. Obviously, with their own self-interest as well. A war on Venezuela would be an incredible disaster for Latin America and the Caribbean. But to, in a position without much strategic fortitude, work against the Trump administration's belligerence right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we have a responsibility to not only oppose U.S. intervention in Venezuela, but also to amplify the voices of all of these other nations that are threatened by U.S. activity in the region too, because I mean, it just really highlights how connected all of these different communities are around the world and how uniformly the United States is the primary bad actor. And when people are basically asking to not use the Caribbean as a staging ground for American intervention, people need to understand that that's an important dynamic of this question as well.
Absolutely. And it's Ralph Gonsalves, who is the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And I would really say, particularly, I want to just really note him and Mia Mottley as well. And of course, also the Prime Minister rally we just played there, of the importance of what they're putting forward and the courage of it. And also, look, I think obviously we don't live in a rules-based system. It's a myth. There's a lot of problems with how the rhetoric of international law is deployed and basically just, not observed. But we still have to remember, even as we critique those models and we know that we need to build new ones, that still is a base in the UN system by which there is any capacity for countries that don't have power in the international system to make an assertion like these Caribbean, CARICOM countries are making right now. So I do want to keep that in the mix as well. Now, this is another thing from our neighborhood. I guess particularly if you're in, New York or New England, but again, I think, all across the United States, we need to be very attentive here. This also happened, and I'm going to also play video here from Telesur English. This is a story of 20 ventilators on their way to Barbados, and apparently what happened according from Bayesian sources.
Destined for Barbados have been seized by the United States. Health Minister Jeffrey Bostic said the ventilators were donated by a well-wisher to help the country handle COVID-19 cases, but were confiscated by U.S. authorities before they could be exported to the Caribbean nation.
Just want to correct something that I would have said earlier in relation to the ventilators that were presented by Rihanna. In fact, 5 of those ventilators are due in next week. The order that I was referring to actually was not the Rihanna order, but another order for 20 ventilators that a philanthropist had consented to purchase for us. Those ventilators were actually stopped in the United States, the exportation of those 20 ventilators.
20 ventilators destined for Barbados have been seized.
That's the clip. So I just want to point out here, this is really important. Obviously, this is bullying of the most obscene sort. But let's be really clear. I know that if you played this clip for somebody that wanted to defend the Trump administration, they would say, wait a second. haven't you been banging on the point that the United States needs to produce its own ventilators, that they need to be delivered to frontline sources in the States, that it's absolutely shameful that we've made supply chains so unresilient that is costing people's lives across the United States? And the answer is 100% yes, of course. The critique and the need for policy answers like national and local supply chains still stands. But this is like the perfect bullshit of this pseudo populism that you get from the Trump world. That because basically the big picture, as we saw earlier with Governor Pritzker, are let's take these ventilators from China, hand them out to private businesses, let them price gouge. Let's talk about using the Defense Production Act to get stuff out there, but not actually use it because the Chamber of Congress and Republican donors don't want it. So at the end of the day, we are still going to let predatory companies accelerate a public health crisis, cost people's lives during a pandemic. But what we can do is some base, disgusting backyard bullying of a country with no geostrategic power to take 20 ventilators that a philanthropist gave them. And that can be our signal that we're keeping things in America seriously, not holding the corporate sector, which is gouging, robbing this country, costing people's lives, into account. And I think, by the way, that's actually a really smart way that you can frame both things as being correct. Like, hey, look, if you're pissed at your government for not taking care of its citizens, you 100% should be. And wanting a government to take care of its citizens and national needs is 100% legitimate and correct. And also, they're trying to distract you by stealing a pittance from a neighbor of yours that if you wanted to think in this direction as well, look, China's doing incredible propaganda for itself by giving ventilators and other needs across the world. This this is the exact opposite message. And even if we wanted to interpret Chinese actions in the most cynical way, which is totally valid to do, frankly, the United States is not even keeping up with that. And so the real answer is don't get distracted by that bullshit. Demand Defense Production Act and that we treat our Caribbean neighbors correctly.
Exactly.
Do you guys have anything? I mean, that really was just, that
pure,
really caught me.
You can't say anything about this other than the fact that that's just pure evil and wickedness. This is, if the United States is preventing medicine from reaching its destination, I mean, there's no other way to frame that other than it's just being pure callousness and wickedness. And it's just shameful. And yeah, people, I'm glad we're highlighting it and people should know. But what this administration does, and also what the United States tends to do, is to throw its weight around and not think about the consequences for the rest of the world. And it's very devastating to see.
It's the most cheap bullshit trick, in addition to being wicked and disgusting in and of itself. Like, oh, we're not going to do anything to nationalize supply chains, do that proper nation state work, which people should want and should demand. What we'll do is we'll deprive Barbados of 20 fucking ventilators. And who knows even where those 20 ventilators will go? There's probably some type of like, Kushner hedge fund that they'll get laundered through or something, right? Are there any more Discord questions?
Can I just say something else about it too?
Yeah, go.
I'm just so into, it's like once you move through I just like literally got hot with anger. And underneath the anger is like heartbreak. And then underneath that is like respect for seeing you just juxtapose those two clips together reminded me of work at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where AOSIS, the Association of Small Island States, primarily in the Caribbean, were both consistently standing up against the bullying of the United States and consistently vulnerable to being bullied themselves. And despite being in that precarious position and being, having higher consequences for standing up for what was right, Caribbean nations were doing what was right. There's a level of inspiration that I think we can take, and just you pairing those two clips together, I think really really resonates with my experience in those arenas too.
And it's also the TMBS advantage, baby. Cover it all. The real solidarity work, the real global work, not the fucking posturing and bullshit. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com